we are going to delve into basically the part of David's life where we can see how God overcame weakness several times in the story of David to show that we can overcome pretty much anything with God by our side. So before we get into that, I did want to look at a few verses to talk about basically what David finally got to. And I want to do this because the reason we're looking at these Old Testament stories or this New Testament spin on it is because we're trying to understand what we can become. Where we're at right now might feel like a place of weakness, a place of, especially as we look at the world around us. It seems like an unsurmountable hill stands in front of us to gain traction back where we have lost so many in the church, how churches seem to all be shrinking during this time, and how are we going to overcome that? We might feel very weak, but this is exactly the position we find time and time again in the Old Testament. I think one of the key reasons, there's a lot of reasons we have the Old Testament, but for our learning, that is what is told to us, and we can learn a lot of what God is able to overcome if people will believe and work for Him. And that's the case with David. So we read about here in Acts, we're going to actually start in the New Testament. Let's look at Acts chapter 13, verses 21 and 22. So just to show how David is remembered, he's not remembered as a weak man. It says here in Acts 13, verse 21, "Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will." And this is what we need to seek after for our own lives, right? That at the end of our lives, God will say this about us. I have found in each one of us, we can insert our names there, a man or woman after my heart who will do all my will. And we're going to see we don't have to be some special man to do it. That's why we're studying Made Perfect in Weakness. David was no special man at the beginning of this, but he was a king. He turned out to be a king in Israel, and he had great treasure and power. Just to show that, I want to start with treasure, so let's go ahead and look at 1 Chronicles. And look at some of his treasure there in the first 4 verses of 1 Chronicles chapter 29. We'll turn back into the Old Testament. And it reads there, "And David, the king, said to the assembly, Solomon my son, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great, for the palace will not be for a man, but for the Lord God." So they're talking about building the temple here. He says, "So I have provided for the house of my God, so far as I was able, the gold for the things of gold, the silver for the things of silver, the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, the wood for the things of wood, and besides great quantities of onyx and stones for setting, antimony, colored stones, all sorts of precious stones and marble. Moreover, in addition to all that I have provided for the holy house, I have treasure of my own, gold and silver, and because of my devotion to the house of God, I give it to the house of my God, 3,000 talents of gold of Orpha, 7,000 talents of refined silver for overlaying the walls of the house." And it goes, on and on about the building of the temple. But what I wanted to focus on is when we were going to pick up with David, he was a shepherd boy, right? And then toward the end of his life, this is what he had been given by God. So he went from nothing to this very powerful, very rich man. And although power and riches are not what we're seeking, we can see he only got to that because of his belief in God, because he was first devoted to God. We can see the power he had too in the story here in 2 Samuel. And he misuses his power here in the story of Bathsheba. But I think if we don't look into that section, which of course has got tons of lessons in it as well, we can just see the power in his position. It says, in the spring of the year, looking at 2 Samuel 11, the first 17 verses, it says, in the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel. So I think that starts out. The king just sent out the servants, and they went to battle for him. He's got to that point. He was a warrior before. Now he's just sending armies here or there. And it says they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. And it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house. So this is the power we're talking about here. He sent men to and fro to do whatever he commanded. In this case, doing something they shouldn't have done for him, but they were still willing to, showing how he was respected, how he commanded power. And the woman conceived and said, she sent and told David, I am pregnant. So David sent the word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing. David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war was going. And when David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet, and Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present of the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house, with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. And when they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said to David, the ark of Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house, and to eat and to drink, and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. So we can see that Uriah was still very committed to David, the power, the respect that he had. It says, then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of the Lord, but he did not go down to his house. And in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. The letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. And Joab was besieging the city, and he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there would be valiant men. And the men of the city came out, fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. Now, this is a bad story of David. This isn't a powerful story at all. In fact, David's going to be greatly punished by the loss of his son. And just a little bit past this story, but what I wanted to look at is just people were willing to bury bodies for David, basically, right? He sent this letter to Joab and said, I need this man killed, and Joab completed that activity for him, right? So this is the man that David became, but he came from very humble beginnings. But he had great treasure and great power. But we're not looking at that part of David's life today, and as I mentioned, there are many lessons we could look at from that reading we just looked at. But we're looking at the shepherd boy. The shepherd boy we see in 1 Samuel chapter 16. So let's go ahead and look back there. We see what God did with David, how much power it accumulated so that David could serve the Lord. But nonetheless, he starts out like this. And it starts in verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. And you shall anoint for him, or for me, him whom I declare to you. So Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, do you come peaceably? And he said, peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So we can see here that we're looking for a new king. Saul is the king at this time. This is before those readings we just had of David being the king with his great treasures and great power. Saul is currently ruling in Israel, but it's time for a change. And Samuel is seeking that out. So in verse 6 and 7, we're going to look, and it says, when they came, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Eliab must have been a son of Jesse. But here in verse 7 it says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And I wrote that down. We'll probably do a lesson on that someday, because that's a great verse. We think about it, right? We think about where the power of the Lord lies. It does not lie in appearance or in speech or any of these things. It lies with the heart. We can see here that is not what Samuel was thinking. Right? When he saw the sons of David, he's like, it's going to be that one. I know it. I can tell. He's the tall one. He's the strong one. He looks like he's going to be a great king for Israel. God said, no, I'm not looking for someone who is strong or who is tall, these types of qualities. And we can think about, I didn't go back, for sake of time with this, but that's what Saul was, right? Saul, they said, stood a head, at least a head above all the people. I think he was trying to duck down at one point to hide from the people trying to anoint him king because he was so tall and so big. What they would think is as a king would look like. And God showed them in Saul, that's not what I was looking for. That is not what you want either. David wasn't going to be like, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the king this time wasn't going to be like that. But let's read on here in 8 through 10. It says, But Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, Neither the Lord has chosen this one. So I assume he was also one that may have looked like a king, looked like someone who could rule the people. So said then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, Neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, The Lord has not chosen these. So I'm sure they're pretty confused at this point, at least Samuel, probably not knowing all of Jesse's sons. He sees 7 people walk in front of him. At least 2 or 3 look like they could be the king, right? They're called out by name. He's thinking, well, it must be this one. If it's not him, it must be him. If it's not him, it must be him. And they all walk by, and Samuel's probably there wondering, who's left? Who could be left? And we can see it's going to be David. Picking up again in verse 11, it says there, Then Samuel said to Jesse, Are all your sons here? And he said, There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy, and had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So we can see what God chose here. We're talking about made perfect in weakness. He did not choose the strongest, the tallest of the boys of Jesse, as he expected. In fact, it's kind of like the Cinderella story, right, where they send the girls to the ball, but really the princess was going to be Cinderella. It was the one that didn't even get to go, the servant, the one who didn't even come to the fancy feast, the sacrifice that they were invited to. They left him behind to tend the sheep. But that is who it was. The weakest and the youngest was chosen to lead the country, to lead the people of Israel. So the point here we want to take away is you don't have to be old or strong or tall or any of these qualities, whatever it may be, to do what you're trying to do to serve God. God is looking for everyone. In fact, if you are one of those who are weak, the young, the weakest amongst what you consider your peers, you might be the one God is looking for, just like he was looking for David. And of course, perhaps when we had David on the screen, we all know we're going to at least get to this story. Made perfect in weakness. We talked about the story of Gideon, how he whittled down his 10,000 troops, I believe it was, down to just 300 to fight this huge army, and how that was successful. And we can see this kind of trope throughout the Bible as we're going through these different stories in the Old Testament. And here's another one that's very popular, something we probably know a lot about, and that is Goliath, the story of David and Goliath. And Goliath was a giant. So I wanted to, let's go ahead and read. We're going to turn over chapter because David, even though he's anointed king, he doesn't become king for a little bit. And in fact, I didn't go into the full story of what happens after David grows up and how he's chased around by Saul, living in caves and things like that. And I think you can make an argument that that is a portion of David's life where he was living in weakness as well, right? Despair, where he didn't seem to be loved by God, where in fact he still was going to be king, as Samuel has anointed him. But we're just going to focus tonight mainly on Goliath's story here for the rest of the lesson. So let's go ahead and look at that. In 2 through 11 and 16 of 1 Samuel 17. And that reads, And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and he drew up a line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now that's hard to understand. Perhaps some of you remember how tall Goliath was, but I wanted to look it up to make sure, and that's about 9'6". So it's pretty big. So you can see that picture there. I tried to make it as big as possible, but he's still pretty small, even blown up to that size on the screen, right? He's a lot bigger than that, but 9 feet, you know. They had a picture of the warrior. He's almost twice as tall as most of the warriors, like 5'8". 9'6" is almost twice that height. He's huge. I remember when I was growing up, we had a really tall guy in the building. I think he was 6'6", and he said, well, I'm not tall enough to be Goliath. And then he got up on a ladder, a step ladder, 3 feet high, and was almost scraping the ceiling. And he said, now I am almost as big as Goliath. He still wasn't quite that big. Goliath was huge when we think about it. And he's carrying a shield here in the little font that you can't read. It says his shield was 125 pounds that he was carrying. You can think about how heavy, how strong Goliath must have been to carry this type of weaponry. And we're going to get to that here. He said he had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armored with a coat of mail, and a weight of the coat with 5,000 shekels of bronze. I take it back. It wasn't his shield. It was his coat. It was 125 pounds. He was carrying 125 pounds on him. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin, and a bronze slung between his shoulders, and the shaft of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield wearer went before him, and he stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel, why have you come out of the battle, or come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me, and if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we shall be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day, and the Philistine, talking about Goliath, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And I think that's important. We talked about that verse earlier where it basically is saying that we need to trust in God. That is what God saw in David. It wasn't about his stature or anything like that. It was about his trust for God. We can see that the army of Israel did not have that trust. They did not have that same trust that was found in David. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. And then we're moving down to verse 16 here. We can get one more. It says, for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. That's a long time, right? We think about 40 days. 40 days is more than a month. They were here camped in this valley. And this giant was coming out and taunting them, saying, come at me. Come here. Come fight me. And again, every day, they lost hope. And he was defying the army, as he announced there. But let's continue on with this story to see where David comes in. We're going to pick up in verse 19. It says, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took provisions and went, as Jesse commanded him. And he came to the encampment with the host, was going out to the battle line, and shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, behold, the champion of the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, caught up out of the ranks of the Philistines, and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine, and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? This is what I wanted to point out. One of the strongest things that David said up to this point, right? The armies of the living God. They didn't seem very much like the army of the living God, right? They were struggling. They were afraid. But this is who they were, and David understood that. David understood that they were the arm of God who was going to fight through them. Let's pick up in verse 32, see how this continues to play out. It says, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not going to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he is a man of war. He's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep the sheep of his father, and when And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. And your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And this is the important part here. David is not saying, I was strong. I am strong and I can defeat these people, this man. He's saying God will defeat him. He believes in God. David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And David goes. Saul could only see the weakness, but David understood the power of God. It goes on, says, then Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put the helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with the coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. And then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. So he didn't even take with him any armor to go fight this giant, this Philistine. I didn't think I'd read that before or remembered that. It says, the part of the story we're probably all remembering, says, then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. But I think it's interesting. David is going up, no one around him, just by himself, and here comes Goliath with his shield bearer in front of him. I thought that's an interesting scene to put. Goliath isn't even approaching David on his own, but David is just walking out to meet this 9'6" giant who has some people with him carrying his stuff. He wouldn't even come up by himself. But David's not afraid. He's ready to go. He's got his stones. He's got his shepherd's pouch. He's got his sling, everything he needs. And he's got God on his side. That is the goal, right? Even though he was just a youth, as it says. And we know the rest of the story here in verse 45. It says, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that the earth may know that this is the God in Israel. And all the assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword or the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So pretty powerful statement there. Not only is he going to defeat the Philistines, he's doing it to show the power of God, not only to the Philistines, but also to the army that's cowering behind him, right? To his fellow Israelites who were unwilling to go meet this person, this youth, this small boy, doesn't even have any type of protection around him. He doesn't need people to carry all of his weapons of destruction that he's talking about Goliath having here, but he's approaching Goliath ready with just the power of God behind him. And continuing on there, and it said, when the Philistine arose and came near and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell, his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. He struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. And David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Exactly what David said would happen by the will of God, he completed. But I think this is interesting. David didn't even have a sword with him. If that rock would have bounced off of Goliath, he would literally have had nothing to combat him. He was that confident, running straight toward the battle line with nothing but a stone and a sling, no backup plan. I just thought that was an interesting thought, because Saul tried to give him a sword. He tried to give him a shield and a sword and his armor. He took none of that. And again, just as the story with Gideon, how it's impossible for this to be the outcome, God's power is shown undoubtedly. That's why these stories are there, is to show the power of God, not only to David, David already believed in it clearly, since he's doing this, right? But to the army of Israel, to the king of Israel at the time, and now to us today, as well as everyone throughout history who's been reading this story. So the question we want to ask ourselves tonight is, do we have a heart like David does, to stand in the face of those who defy the Most High God? And this is the kind of the spin. Each one we've done has its own spin to it, and this is the idea. David was upset because of what Goliath was doing. Not that he was standing in the face of Israel. He was more than just an enemy of Israel. He was defying Israel. He was literally making fun of them, making fun of God's power. And David said, that is not going to be the case. This is the army of the living God. You are not going to make fun of my God. I will be the one, if no one else will, do this. Paul was content with his weakness. We won't go to 2 Corinthians 12 because we've gone there, every time. I think we know what that's talking about, where this comes from, to be made perfect in weakness. But David, he didn't even consider his weakness, I believe, as we read this story. He didn't think about himself being a youth like Saul did, or unarmored like Saul was trying to get him to take these things. He just ran right into it. And we need to think if we're ready to do this as well. David ignored his weaknesses and trusted God. We can think, what of our, each one of us can think right now, what are our weaknesses, fears, shortcomings, challenges we're facing right now? I doubt they're as serious as what was going to befall David, with Goliath on the other side of the battle line. Certain death awaited him if it weren't for God between the two of them. And then we can ask ourselves the question, does God have power to overcome them if we trust him? And we saw what he did for David, and I hope we can understand what is on the line for us if we can only trust him. And for the last section of the lesson, let's just read that one more time at the bottom. Quote from this story. It says, "For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." And although that was directly applicable to Goliath here, I think that is still applicable for us today, because we have a spiritual battle that we are fighting continually today, and we have the power of God behind us if we're willing to have a faith and a trust like David to fight against our Goliath, whatever that may be to each one of us. Well, I hope you found this to be helpful and encouraging as we look at the power of God. That's what we've been studying these. He has given us so many examples of how he's taken weakness to show us his power. That is really what these are about. It isn't about the weakness of the individuals or the weakness of the situations. It's about the power of God. And we can see his power because he is willing to forgive us. He is willing to overcome basically what we deserve. As we see here, the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. He had the power to forgive us, and he has chosen to use that power for us. We have the plan of salvation if we have teaching someone or have not become a Christian. And of course, if we fall short after we have been through the plan of salvation, if we fail to stay faithful and to grow, then we of course can repent and pray for forgiveness and always ask for help from our brothers and sisters. So if we can help you in any way this evening, I encourage you to come forward now as we stand and sing the invitation song.